Hi, Dr. Gabayan. Welcome to the podcast. I'm so happy and excited to have you here. So my first question is always to pass it back to my guests and allow them to introduce themselves in their own words to the listening audience about who they are and what they do.
I am Dr. Laura Gabayan, and I am a physician researcher. For years, I was interested in wisdom. I studied about it, and then I interviewed 60 people about wisdom and across the U.S. and Canada, so hence North America. And I put it into 8 elements that they had in common in a book called Common Wisdom. So that's why I'm here today to tell you about the book.
Yeah, I'm super excited to unpack that with you today. This is a spiritually intersectional podcast. So it's a personal development, healing, and spirituality. I'm always curious about everybody's early childhood experience in religion, spirituality, or nothing at all. And then sort of what do they center themselves in as an adult? So if you'll walk us through that journey in your life.
It's funny because my father's a physician. I'm a physician. Spirituality was not ever something I learned about or thought about. And in med school as well is something I didn't think about. And so it was not, I would probably say that was the hardest chapter to write in my book because I didn't really have an understanding of it. After I connected with the 60 people, I realized more and more so it's really part of their life. It's a big part of their life. And it also became more part of my life as I talked to them. And so growing up, no, it was never part of my life. And my mom was not religious or spiritual. And so she just never taught me anything. My dad kind of mocked it. If you believed in miracles, he thought it was a joke. So
Yeah.
spirituality was nothing ever part of their life. So no, I didn't really grow up with it.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that's totally okay. And that is very interesting. So thank you for going into that level of detail. So we do have you here today to talk about your book, Common Wisdom, 8 Elements of Meaningful Life. And like you said, it's based on the Wisdom Project, which as I understand was conducted between October 20 and April 23, an actual research study comprised of 60 participants aged 50 to 79 who had been nominated by somebody in their ecosystem and designated as a wise person. And you and your team conducted these 30-minute meetings with like really specific questions to extrapolate their own wisdom. Did I leave anything out about the details of how this incepted?
It started because I'm a researcher and I believe in objectivity. And I was really taken aback as to how such an important topic, wisdom, was just left to, this person said this religion thinks this, the Buddha thinks this. And I'm like, really? It's just thoughts, and this is what they think. As with all projects, you base it on what's out there. And so I looked at all the journals, and they'd done research on it, and they had found different age groups. And based on that, I was like, okay, let me hire a research assistant and let me hire someone that can serve as a marketing person. And then we started interviewing 60 people. Now, did any of them really know each other? No, they had no idea. And I had no input into who they were because that would be biased. But yet their messages were very similar. It was very fascinating because there were people all over and they said similar things.
Yeah, and I did want to ask, so was this actually done under like a clinical trial, like in a protocol and approved through like an IRB and all of that? Was that process done?
I didn't want it. I mean, the key to all of this is not to be biased and not to have a certain perspective and not to lean one way because you are a fan of this or whatever. So, no, there was no IRB and there was no sense of, oh, we're doing it because of this institution or that. And I remember my husband was at the end was like, well, how did you find these 60 people? Telling everyone about it and telling them I'm doing this project. And then I was like, if you know someone wise, let me know. And it was anyone, And then we posted on Reddit, we posted it on Nextdoor, we posted on social media. And so that's where we got the people. Now then we realized, well, one person must know someone wise. if they do. And so I remember one person I spoke with, she's like, oh yeah, I went to college with this person. They made good decisions. They're very wise. So that's just how the nomination process began, like started and how it ended. Like they kind of knew people that were wise.
I wanted to also talk about the 8 elements of wisdom that are listed out in the book. I don't know if you want to say what those are, and then I have kind of some questions specifically about how they are interconnected, and asking you whether you felt like one was more pronounced than another in the study. But do you want to tell us what those 8 elements of wisdom are?
So the team and I, the research assistant and the marketing person, we looked at every video over and again, and we assigned an element to them. Based on these elements, the first one is the most common in all of them, and the last one is less common. So the 8 elements were resilience, kindness, positivity, spirituality, humility, tolerance, creativity, and curiosity. And so we definitely saw resilience in a lot more people than we did curiosity, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And throughout the book, I've mentioned examples of people and their situations. And I've also mentioned people in general who've been resilient, not just
Mm-hmm.
the people I interviewed, but historical figures.
How were the 8 elements in your mind's eye interconnected with each other when people had at least all 8 of them, if not a handful of them?
Well, only one person had all 8. And so that
Okay.
kind of goes back to the idea that, you know what, wisdom is not all or nothing. It's not one size fits all. But
Mm-hmm.
I would say they are interconnected because, for example, like it's to be tolerant, you have to be kind, and you have to be humble. And humility relate to being kind too. So all 3 of those are a way to connect to others, to treat others with respect, treat others with like a way you want to be treated. They're connected in that regard. So resilience, the very first one, to be resilient, you have to be like, oh, I'm gonna get over this. No, I am strong, and you have to be positive. That and you have to be hopeful and optimistic. So they're all related. When you think about it, it's more of okay, what am I strong at, and what can I build on? It's not, do I have all 8, for example.
Yeah, and I can imagine most of us don't have all 8, even if we get through the entirety of our life, through all of our experiences. That's why I was curious, and you answered it back there about the pronunciation of each element being either stronger or, less pronounced, because I can imagine our life experiences also really shape that. I was interested in asking you this question about innate wisdom versus learned wisdom, and I wondered like how they differ, and does one have more depth than the other in your opinion?
So I think from what I've seen, innate wisdom is kind of like internally what you tell yourself, right? It's what is part of who you are. Learned is kind of, what people think happens to them, but it's really what I think happens for them. And it's really what they learn from an experience. And so innate wisdom, in a way, it's how you're born. And this book kind of tells you, you know what, we may have some innate wisdom, but we can become wiser. We can develop one of the 8 elements or more of the 8 elements, and develop learned wisdom. So I think it's just a matter of perspective of, you know what, this is how I am, this is how I think. That's the innate part. And then, life will give me all of this for me to learn. So that's the learned wisdom part. Now, wisdom, I didn't know what it was. I had no idea what wisdom is, and that's why I did this. And so saying that, it's hard to say that with people understanding it. And especially now with the internet, the glitz and glamour that's promoted in social media, wisdom is not a sexy topic. And so I think it's just important to realize that it's hard to understand, but it does make your life more meaningful.
Mm-hmm. And where did you find empathy fitting in all of this through the process of did you see that interwoven through the characteristics of all of the wise people in the 8 elements?
I would probably say empathy fell under kindness. And
Mm-hmm.
and it was it's a sense of relating and it's connecting as well as also being kind to someone. So it fell under kindness. And so that's how you do this type of research is you start with a lot of different, categories and you cut it down. So that whenever in the book I talk about a sub theme, it is because it was a big one that felt like under spirituality. Prayer was a big one. And you don't create your own element of prayer, but prayer fell under spirituality. So same with empathy. I vividly remember I think I talked about him in my kindness chapter, but empathy was really important to this one of my interviewees.
Yeah, and I wondered with the empathy too, because when we think about the innate versus the learned, I would imagine too, like it also straddles both of those. Because, like you said, sometimes our wisdom is our inner knowing of what is wise for the choices we make, and how we treat people
Right.
and all of those things. Yeah, and then the learned piece, I think, is part of the empathy experience, is trying to understand somebody that's not like you and living in their life for a moment and becoming wise from their life experience without having gone through it, which I think is really important.
But you see, people are not gonna think, "Oh, yay, I have a problem. I'm gonna learn from this." No, they're not. They're gonna be like, "Oh no, oh God, why? Why did this have to happen?" And so I think the idea of attaining wisdom or learned wisdom is hard to understand because it's not natural. It's not natural for someone to think, "Oh, okay, great, it's gonna make me a stronger person." You know.
This podcast brings a lot of people, and I would describe myself as this as an alchemist, that we don't throw anything away, that everything has its usefulness, good, bad, in between. And the idea of that you're talking about right there is like using everything in order to learn and to grow and become more resilient. I think there is a huge section of our population that really wants to avoid pain. And so, like, if you're already feeling the pain of your own lived experience, the last thing you want to do, and like you said, it's not sexy to deep dive into your own, you know, your own like mortal, coil about what's going on. So I love that you said that.
Yeah.
I did want to ask you about what you learned in doing this research about your own wisdom, and if your ideas changed or solidified or anything in between. Like, where did it end up taking you personally in this journey?
Well, I learned that it's not all or nothing, right? It's not like someone has it and someone doesn't, and there's more to it. I think what shocked me and what kind of stayed with me the most was the spirituality because I was not a very spiritual person, and I think I was taken aback of how it was a large part of their lives. Overall, what I learned was, what, you can't break it down. You can kind of tailor it to yourself, and you can't be like, "Oh, I'm not good at this. Let me make it better," or "I am good at this. Let me highlight it," or you know what I mean. You can't. That's what I learned is that it can be scientifically defined. Coming from a scientist. And it can be hit or miss in a way. You can have the parts that are not strong and the parts that are. Taken from someone who did not understand it. I think that's how I want other people to see it. It's not a very sexy topic, as I've said, but it's
Yes.
something that everyone can understand and learn about.
One of the big themes and questions was like, if we're going on this journey and we're acquiring wisdom, I think you asked the question of like, is this adding meaning to our lives, or is it like the inverse? I can't remember how you phrased it. Where do you see the value in wisdom as a tool to cultivate meaning in our life?
I think it's more of, everything in life is there to help me grow. And how am I growing? The wise had a more peaceful, content way of looking at things, yes. And the why, for example, I told someone, oh, humor was part of our positivity chapter. It's a big something.
Yeah.
And someone was like, "Oh, that's he was very funny." And I mentioned in my book, and he grew up with alcoholic parents who were laughing all the time. So he thought, "Oh, that must be part of how he grew up, right?" I'm like, no, we're seeing this as a common thread. A lot of people that humor is a big part of it. And then he's like, "Oh yeah, it was humor that got me through cancer. It was humor that got me through it." Like it was amazing how it was humor that really got him through life. So
The second piece of that question is I'm asking about adding meaning to our life when we're looking at wisdom, adding meaning to life. I think which was part of this as well, and some of the work that you did was understanding that aspect of it as well.
I mean, how do we add meaning, or does it add meaning, right?
Yes,
So
does it add meaning?
so I think it's a twofold question. I mean, you have a certain perspective of you know of let's say you get diagnosed with with a disease, and that gives you a sense of meaning going through it, but how you handle it to begin with is also, I feel like people who are wiser may look at it as a bigger opportunity to excel or to learn to grow, whereas someone who's not may think it's a disaster or may think it's horrible. So I think it definitely does give you meaning in that you learn, but as I said, it also helps you kind of grow too.
And so where do you see self-awareness playing a part in that? Because I think the nuanced difference between somebody who asks the question, why is this happening to me, versus how is this teaching me something, or how can I use this to my benefit to grow from it? What is the nuance, and how important is it to have self-awareness as a part of the cultivation of wisdom itself?
I mean that falls under resilience, I would say. And it's more of, something's happening for me and not to me. And it falls under, okay, I can do X and I will do X, but so I'm aware, but I can't do that and I need help. Or so being resilient is not, so that goes back to being self-aware too, is knowing what you can and can't do. And so being resilient means, okay, I can do this, but I need help in that. And so it's funny because a lot of people view asking for help as a sign of weakness, but no, it's a sign of strength. It's a sign of, you know what, I can't do that. I need help with that. And I respect myself enough to need help with it. So that's it's a sign of resilience to kind of think that way as well.
Yeah, I love that. I was wondering too, if you're going to do like a phase two of this research at some point, and maybe include younger cohorts, or where are you thinking you want to take this research, or do you want to take it into another phase, or trying to understand different cohorts or groups or anything like that?
I don't know if I will. I mean, I foresee this as kind of, I feel like it'll change lives. We did have a question as to the advice that older generation had for the younger generation. I'm not so sure the younger generation is really interested in wisdom right now, because may not be there, getting likes and followers. I don't know. They may not be really interested in it right now. So I don't know. I don't know where this is gonna lead. Someone was like, well, many people ask me, oh, well, you're an author now. Have you thought of writing next book? I'm like, no, I don't plan on writing many books.
Yes, and I know it's kind of like it's akin to asking somebody who's just had a baby, like, are you going to have another baby? So I know it's like a very loaded question, but I did want to ask. So thank you for that. I also had a question about, and I don't know how. I'm sorry, I should have said this at the beginning. Like, I've not read this book, so I don't know the in-depth details of what's in each specific chapter here. But and so I apologize here if this is in the book and I don't know for sure. But I wondered if there was anything you learned from people who had a high resiliency, were they more prone to have endured traumatic experience? Was there any
Oh my God.
correlation there for you guys, or what did you find?
It's funny because it was a sense of you don't give up. You don't give up because if you give up, you've given up on life. And it was a sense of, of put the emotions aside. They're not fun. They're hard, but they kind of get in the way. But you have to just deal with it and tackle it head on. And so yeah, in my resilience chapter, I have several people. The one that comes to mind, and I won't tell you details of what happened, but a lot happened to her. And I mentioned her name, Elise. And a lot happened to her, including a lot of domestic issues. In addition to having lost a child and losing a grandchild, and despite all of that, she's a very happy-go-lucky, bubbly person that opened a church, and it was a pleasure to meet her. And so I think that was the main idea is, okay, it happens. It's not easy. It was emotionally difficult, but it didn't stop me from going on.
Yeah, interesting. So my follow-up question there was when you think about wisdom and integration, because I feel like they're very deeply connected, because when we're bumping up against wisdom, like I only know I've acquired the wisdom until I'm through the experience and I can see back and make different decisions, and I can present differently. I'll say that's been my experience. But there's also like the integration of the experience itself that allows us to, I would say, contain that wisdom and also continue to cultivate it. How important do you think integration of wisdom along a person's life journey?
Well, it starts with how you look at something that happens, right? And then you're right, as you said, looking back at it, just saying, how was that? How did that affect me? What did I learn from that, right? So when you say integrating, that's what you're talking about. You're saying, how did that affect me? And so I feel like integrating is what it kind of adds to your, in a way, think of it as, a bucket, right? And so it adds to your bucket of, oh, I've gone through that. And I mentioned that in the book as your mental muscle. Like it's kind of just added to what you can endure, what you can go through, all of that. So it just adds.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a strengthening and a sort of like, if you were to think about an athlete, working on their own specific body, like when you practice resiliency and tolerance and kindness and all of these things through your life journey, but as you're acquiring wisdom, it makes you a stronger person to be able to interact with the world, right?
And makes it easier. Like once
Yes.
you do it, you kind of do it again. We don't all know these things. Even I'm sure the guy who got all eight, his name was Larry, and he got all eight. And I'm sure he didn't grow up with all of them to begin with. I met him when he was 79. He's like, oh, I made it. I made your project because it was a few months away from him turning 80. So it takes time, and it takes you kind of looking back and thinking, what did that teach me?
I was really curious too about the element of tolerance. I am a practicing Buddhist. This is one of the things we learn very early on. If you deep dive, if you take the path of Buddhism, like tolerance is right behind compassion and kindness as a practice to, first take in for yourself and then take out into the world. I wondered if you could say a little bit about that in your book and what you found out about tolerance and the people who are really practicing this from a wise and beautiful space. What does that look like?
It's funny because when we assign people being tolerant, I think they were patient and they're open to learning about other people, cultures, everything about others as well. And so they weren't just someone asked, well, does that mean they're putting up with other? I'm like, no, they were they were generally interested in learning about other people, and they showed a kind of patience and they felt like patience was a form of kindness too. So tolerance was a way to connect as well. And so we assigned tolerance to people who talked about how it was important for them to get to know others and be open to others and not be non-judgmental, and also patient.
Yeah, I think tolerance and patience are like basically two sides of the same coin
Right.
because you have to have, I feel like in some situations, I think we probably see this a lot in our current structure of people being very, very decisive in political situations and things like that. You know, it requires a great level of patience and tolerance to hear somebody out, to not get agitated or take what they say personally and take it in and try to understand them without reacting. I think that's huge. I was actually surprised to see creativity on this list. Creativity, I feel like, is everything, but that would be an element of wisdom. When I was thinking about it for this show, in some ways I would imagine, and I'm curious what you'll say what happened in the book, but it would almost take a deep level of creativity to sort of wiggle your way out of a lot of situations and become stronger and more resilient and positive. So what was creativity in this element in this book? I'm really curious what you found out.
So it's funny because a lot of us we start being creative. And little kids are very creative, right?
Yeah.
They put sheets over chairs and they make it a fort, and all of a sudden it's like a hut and this and that. And so kids are creative. We just get it beaten out of us as adults, right? Because of life and because we don't have time, because of all the other things we have to do. So we all have it in us. And I think what I notice is it's not what we think is, oh, if you're an artist, if you're this, you're creative. No, it was more of having hope and having imagination and having a sense of, oh, I'm going to come up with that play or that screenwriter, or just having a sense of thinking outside the box. So that's why it kind of leads back to having wisdom, is because it kind of lets you imagine what it can be. And so in many ways, it kind of connects to being spiritual too. And that if you are creative and you kind of think about, wait, something else can happen, and that the divine can take part in this, or just being more creative,
More open.
more open in a way.
Yeah, and also probably finding creative solution in your life, which is I think a huge thing to help cultivate wisdom.
But ironically, we interviewed a few or one scientist or two, and both talked about how creativity is really important to them. And I'm like, well, it's interesting being a scientist. It is important because you have to be creative and thinking about what you can think about, what you can test. But it's also, you can't be too creative, right? But yeah, I think it's really important in general.
I work in clinical research, so you're right about that. I mean, the scientists and people in that field, I believe, are very much innovator and creators. But once you have the idea, you do have to put guardrails on it because you've got to test it. You've got to, put some parameters around it. So I think that's the funny thing you're talking about there. It's really counterintuitive. The other element that I was really interested in knowing, or well, the last two here that I really want to talk to you, first humility, and then we'll get into curiosity. But humility, I think, is something that it's a word I think sometimes has left our general consciousness. Like it's not something we say often anymore. I only heard it in my religious experience growing up. So I wondered if you could talk about it. Like, what does that actually mean in the book specifically? And what did you learn about people who have this as one of the elements that helps them be a wise person?
The goal of all of this is to connect to other people and to respect everyone. It kind of overlaps with kindness, it kind of overlaps with tolerance, as I said. And so in the book, you'll see I spoke about lots of people who are very humble, like very well accomplished, but it was not important to them. I don't know if I talked about him in my humility part, but he is a high level executive, or he was at Disney. And yet his focus and what he really cared to talk about were the two nonprofit organizations he created, and how Or another guy I talked about, he's a record producer and he created over 100 million records before the age of the internet. That's really hard. I mean, we can't even imagine doing anything before the internet, right? And he did it, and that was definitely not his. And so I had to email him. I'm like, wait, how many number one singles did you have? I'm like, it's just he is very well accomplished, and he realized that not just him, everyone. Humility is kind of like a sense of realizing that that person's a human being, and that takes precedence over everything else, and they deserve respect regardless. And I especially see a lot of it in my field of medicine. People who are healers or people who are providing alternative forms of treatment are not regarded the same way by physicians. And a part of me is like, well, the end goal is the same. We all want the patient to heal. We all want them to get better. So humility is actually really important. It shows how great you are to feel like you don't need to boast about yourself. It just shows that you're confident. You have inner confidence. You don't need to kind of explain to others.
I don't know if in the book, but like some elements of these people being egoless in that regard, because they don't have to dominate you with their accolades or their status or their money or their power. They're just seeing everybody as the same. And that's such a beautiful place for us to remember our shared humanity in every interaction. I think is really important, right?
I agree. Nowadays, it's really sad with the internet, with likes and followers. It's like the person with more followers is more important. I'm like, really? Oh, or celebrities. No offense towards them.
I feel very similar to that too. And I also feel like it also undermines all of the regular people like you, me, and that are doing like just the most important work to shift the collective shared human experience in a way that is meaningful. The last one here of the elements that I was really curious about in the book was curiosity, because oftentimes I tell people here on the podcast, it's been a huge part of my own personal journey, is curiosity has become my spiritual practice. And that was in response to my religious experience, which was very black and white, which required no questioning or curiosity about anything. So once I left that experience in my late 20s, I spent a good majority of my life asking all the questions, reading all the things, like interacting with people I normally wouldn't. And it's been life-changing for me. So curiosity to me has been my spiritual practice of coming home to myself. But what did you find out in the book about people who had a zest for curiosity? I really want to know.
Curiosity is a way to have hope. It's a way to wonder and have and it's similar to creativity. It's something we have as kids, right? But we start losing, and it's very interesting because it makes you question the status quo, but at the same time think outside of it and become more spiritual. And so the people I've talked about my curiosity chapter were. It's funny because I remember talking about that scientist being curious about, what can he do next? And the curiosity I saw was more of was spiritual. That's where the overlap comes in. You say how it's your spiritual practice. I feel like curiosity is kind of a sense of wonder.
And sometimes I feel like it's the antidote to fear, which like is a hallmark of suppressing inquisitive inquiry and like, expansion of thought and ideas and things. And so for me, it's also been a great way to overcome any fear I had, is like, well, if I'm feeling afraid about a person, a situation, or a place, like what can I ask here that will help me understand my surroundings, the people, and the situation? It just allows for, I think, a lot more grace and not to be so scared in certain situations.
I did not think of it, but that's a good one. I did not think of it as an antidote to fear. I felt like an antidote to fear was fate. For example, if someone has a kid and the kid gets older and they start driving and then people are in fear. Oh no, what's going to happen? Or not just with the kid, in general. Everything, you worry. right? Oh no, this, that, this. I'm like, first of all, having faith that it'll be okay. It'll work itself out is gonna take the fear out of you. And knowing that you know what? My fears don't kind of manifest. How often do they manifest? Yo, if so, is this gonna happen? That can happen. This can happen. No, they don't. They don't really happen.
I'm mindful of the time. I want to give you some space here to say anything else about the book and the work that you do that we might have not been able to highlight or I missed in my questions. Like, I'm just going to pass it back to you, whatever you feel like you want to say here.
I just think that common wisdom it approaches wisdom from the perspective of I have no idea what this is. And it's not one size fits all. It's not all or nothing. It's so many different elements. And I feel like common wisdom brings meaning to life and brings meaning to not only your life, but the way you interact with others. So I would definitely look into not only buying it and learning about it, but revisiting it in 10 years, 20 years, whatever. Because common wisdom can be like a friend, like a companion, and it can be there for you during thick and thin. It can be there to kind of lift you in times that you don't think. And so it's an investment I feel like that will last for a long time.
And we change so much and our life circumstances changes. So we might look at it differently each chapter. So I love that you said that.
It changed so much. And that's why I feel like every chapter you'll see when you get the book is that it asks questions, and I have dates because I realize that your answers to a question are different today and as they will be in 5 years. Like, for example, spirituality, that'll change, right? And how spiritual someone is in their 20s versus 50s, it varies. So everything changes, and I think that having that really helps, and having that perspective that you know what, it'll be there for me through all of this is really helpful.
Yeah, beautiful. And what do you have coming up in terms of like speaking engagements, any book events? Like, what do you have anything going on that you want to make the listening and watching audience aware of before we wrap up?
No, I have a lot of podcasts, and I'll put those on my website. So no
Okay.
speaking engagements yet. We'll get
there. Okay. And then I always like to check in with my guests before we end the show and check in with them about 3 things that they're grateful for, either this week, this month, this year, sort of anything that's in your consciousness at this time.
So I'm grateful for my family and my kids because I didn't really grow up with a big family. I was an only child of divorced parents at a very young age. And so I'm grateful for my family now. I'm grateful for, it's funny, it's a weird thing. This is why I believe that things happen for you and not to you. So I have chronic Lyme disease, and I am not able to walk around that much. And in many ways, it let me do this work and write this book. It has affected my brain. It has affected the way I speak. And that's why I prefer not to schedule anything coming up. But it will go away. And right now, it kind of has served a purpose. So I'm great in a weird way. I'm grateful for that condition. And the third thing I'm grateful for is being able to make my voice heard with this book. And I feel like I'm not here to sell books. That's not my goal. It's really to change lives. And I feel like this book will do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're adding this work to a very important, a huge like cross section of so many people that I think can benefit for it. So I think that's a great third thing to be grateful for. Well, I had such a wonderful time with you. I'm glad that we were able to connect in this way, and I really appreciate you coming to my show. This podcast was written, directed, and produced by me, your host, Krista Ziomara, in alignment with Light Casting. Music curated and created by Mr. Pixie. You can find I'm Awake Now What on all social media channels by searching IANW Podcast.
Head over to your favorite podcast app and subscribe, download, rate, and review. Come back every Sunday to partake in a new and enlightening conversation. May you be filled with love and light until we meet again.